In the space of 50 years, every major civilization on Earth went dark. Not one, not two, all of them. The Mycenaeans, gone. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for 500 years and fought Egypt to a draw, gone. The trading city of Ugarit, which had survived invasions, famines, and 3 centuries of political upheaval, gone. The palace economies of Canaan, Cyprus, the Levant, gone. Simultaneously, within a single human lifetime. And then, for 400 years, silence. No writing, no monumental architecture, no long-distance trade. The people who remained didn't rebuild what had existed. They couldn't. They had forgotten how. This is not a myth. This is not a theory. This is the archaeological record of the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, documented in destruction layers, in abandoned palaces, in tools left on workbenches, and grain left in storage jars, and letters left in kilns, waiting to be sent to a world that had already stopped existing. We were taught that invaders did this, that a mysterious horde called the Sea Peoples swept through the Mediterranean like a tide of violence and extinguished every light. That explanation is wrong. And in 2014, a historian at George Washington University assembled 30 years of archaeological, geological, and climate data into a single argument that changes what this collapse means. Not just for the Bronze Age, but for right now. That argument is in Act 4. And once you hear it, the standard story doesn't just seem incomplete. It seems like a choice. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. In 1929, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Ugarit, a Bronze Age port city on the Syrian coast, found a clay tablet still inside a kiln. The tablet was a letter. It had never been sent. Ugarit was one of the most sophisticated trading cities in the ancient world. Population estimates put it at around 8,000 people. It had a palace, a merchant quarter, warehouses full of imported copper and tin, diplomatic archives in 5 languages. Ships from Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, and the Aegean docked in its harbor. It was the kind of city that didn't just survive, it coordinated. It was a hub in a network that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Aegean, from the Nile Delta to the Anatolian Plateau. And in approximately 1185 BCE, it stopped. Not slowly, not through gradual decline. The archaeological record at Ugarit shows a city in mid-operation when the end came. Grain in storage jars, tools left on benches, a bronze sword half-finished in a workshop, and the kiln, still warm, archaeologists noted, full of tablets waiting to be hardened so they could be sent. One of those tablets was a letter from the king.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
King of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, the Bronze Age name for Cyprus. The message described enemy ships offshore. It asked for military assistance. It was formal, urgent, and completely functional in tone. There was no panic in the phrasing. This was a king doing what kings did, reaching through the diplomatic network that had held his world together for generations. The letter was found in the ruins of Ugarit. The reply, also found there, said help was coming. Neither message ever arrived. Ugarit was destroyed before the correspondence could move. What the tablets tell us isn't just that the city fell. It's that the people inside it didn't know it was ending. They were still operating the system, still sending letters, still expecting answers. According to Klein's analysis, in 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, Princeton 2014, Ugarit is not an isolated case. At the same stratigraphic layer, the same approximate moment in time, the palace at Mycenae was abandoned. The Hittite capital Hattusa was burned. The city of Megiddo in Canaan was destroyed. Tiryns, Lachish, Ashdod. The archaeological signature is nearly identical across hundreds of miles. Sudden abandonment, evidence of fire, and then silence. No rebuilding, no reoccupation at the same scale. Just a layer of ash, and above it, a much simpler world. The question the tablets don't answer is the one that matters. Why did every city fall at the same time? And then there's Brandon Drake. Brandon Drake is a paleoclimatologist. In 2012, he published a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science that would quietly reframe everything historians thought they understood about 1200 BCE. We'll get to what he found. But first, the version of events that most people carry. The standard account is clean, almost elegant in its simplicity. Around 1200 BCE, a mysterious confederation of peoples appeared from somewhere in the northern Mediterranean, possibly the Aegean, possibly Anatolia, possibly both, and began moving south and east in a wave of destruction. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III recorded their advance in graphic detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. He described a world in flames. No land could stand before their arms. He claimed to have stopped them at the borders of Egypt in a massive land and sea battle around 1177 BCE. He may have been right. He may also have been exaggerating, as pharaohs tended to do. Either way, the narrative stuck. For most of the 20th century, the sea peoples were the answer. The Mycenaeans fell because the sea peoples attacked. The Hittites fell because the sea peoples attacked. Ugarit burned because the sea peoples arrived. It was a clean causal chain, violent migration in, civilization out. The model fit neatly into the way Western historians were already inclined to think about civilizational collapse. External shock, barbarian pressure, the eternal vulnerability of the cultivated world to forces outside it. It became the version taught in schools, the version repeated in documentaries. Robert Drews, in The End of the Bronze Age, Princeton, 1993, gave the military invasion theory its most rigorous modern form, arguing that a shift in infantry tactics, specifically the adoption of slashing swords and javelins, gave mobile raiders a decisive advantage over chariot-dependent Bronze Age armies. The theory was coherent. It was published. It was cited. There are three things wrong with it. The first one takes about 30 seconds to explain. The Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms occasionally trading luxury goods across the Mediterranean. It was a system, a genuinely integrated, interdependent economic system unlike anything the world would see again for another 3,000 years. Egypt exported grain and gold. Cyprus exported copper. Tin came overland from Afghanistan, through Mesopotamia, through the Levant, to the foundries where it was mixed with copper to make bronze. Without that tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no tools, no weapons, no agricultural implements at scale. Every civilization in the network depended on every other part of the network to function. A grove of ancient juniper trees in Turkey has been recording this story in its rings since before Ugarit was built. The temperature record preserved in those tree rings shows something that no military history could explain on its own. The official records say one thing. The evidence says something else entirely. Blackout. That's the word in the title. Not conquest. Not invasion. Blackout. A blackout isn't caused by an enemy. It's caused by a failure in the system that was supposed to keep the lights on. Brandon Drake's 2012 study analyzed pollen samples and isotope data from lake sediment cores across the eastern Mediterranean. a geological record that doesn't lie, doesn't exaggerate, and has no political interest in the outcome. What it showed was a sharp, sustained cooling and aridification event beginning around 1200 BCE and intensifying through 1150. Rainfall dropped, temperatures fell. Across the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece simultaneously, the agricultural conditions that had supported dense urban populations for centuries deteriorated within a single generation. This was not a bad harvest. This was a structural failure of the food supply across an entire hemisphere. And here is where the system's greatest strength became its fatal vulnerability. The Late Bronze Age network was extraordinarily efficient at moving surplus. Egypt had grain, Canaan had olive oil, Cyprus had copper, the Aegean had silver and pottery. When conditions were good, this interdependence multiplied the prosperity of every node in the network. A drought in one region could be offset by imports from another. The system had redundancy, or seemed to. What it did not have was resilience to simultaneous, multi-regional stress. According to Klein's synthesis, in 1177 BC, the archaeological evidence shows not a single catastrophic moment, but a cascading sequence. Drought reduced agricultural surplus. Reduced surplus disrupted the trade routes that depended on predictable exchange. Disrupted trade meant that the tin shipments from Afghanistan slowed, then stopped. Without tin, bronze production declined. Without bronze, the armies and agricultural tools that maintained political order began to degrade. He signed the form anyway. That phrase, that image, applies here in a specific way. The administrators of these collapsing cities kept issuing documents, kept recording grain allocations, kept sending diplomatic correspondence. The bureaucratic machinery of the Bronze Age ran on its own momentum, even as the foundations beneath it crumbled. Archaeologists find administrative tablets in the destruction layers of multiple cities, not abandoned in panic, but filed, organized. The scribes were doing their jobs until the moment they couldn't. Ugarit's destruction layer contains evidence of a violent end. Burned roof timbers, collapsed walls. But the tablets in the kiln weren't records of crisis. They were routine correspondence, trade agreements, diplomatic formalities. The city's administrative apparatus was functioning normally right up until the fire. Seismologists have added another variable. A study by Amos Noor and Don Burgess, published in Apocalypse, The Late Bronze Age Collapse, Princeton, 2008, documented a sequence of major earthquakes along the Levantine fault system between 1225 and 1175 BCE, including events that left identifiable destruction signatures at Ugarit, Megiddo, and Tiryns. Not every city that fell was destroyed by earthquake, but enough were damaged that the already stressed infrastructure of ports, roads, and storage facilities was further degraded at precisely the moment the network could least absorb the shock. Drought, trade disruption, bronze shortage, earthquakes. Each cause individually survivable. Together, arriving within the same 50-year window, they overwhelmed a system that had never been designed to fail all at once. The official account says the Sea Peoples arrived around 1200 BCE. The first cities were already abandoned by 1230. We aren't just looking at a mistake anymore. We are looking at a pattern. The Sea Peoples did exist. That much is not in dispute. Ramesses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu name them specifically: the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. He describes their movement in terms of total displacement. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. His account has the texture of genuine crisis, not manufactured propaganda. Egypt was threatened. The battle at the Nile Delta in approximately 1177 BCE was real. But look at what the inscriptions actually say about where the sea
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
peoples came from. They came from lands that had already fallen. The Peliset are identified by most Egyptologists, including Trude Dothan in The Philistines and Their Material Culture, Yale, 1982, as originating from the Aegean. The same Aegean where Mycenae had already collapsed. The Chequer and Shekelesh show material culture consistent with Anatolia and Cyprus, regions already in flames when Ramesses III fought them. These were not invaders arriving from outside the system to destroy it. They were people who had already lost everything, moving through the wreckage of a world they had once been part of, looking for somewhere that still had food. The Sea Peoples were refugees, not the cause of the collapse, the human face of it. Displaced populations cascading through a network that was already failing, accelerating destruction that was already underway. In the same way that a crowd fleeing a fire can cause as much structural damage as the fire itself. This reframing, from invaders to refugees, changes everything about what the collapse means. 5b. Evidencia. And this is where it gets interesting. Because if the Sea Peoples were a symptom rather than a cause, then the collapse of the Bronze Age was not an event that happened to these civilizations from outside. It was a failure that grew from within the system's own architecture. Eric Klein uses the term perfect storm, but that undersells the structural argument. A perfect storm implies bad luck. What the evidence actually shows is something more disturbing. A system that was optimized for efficiency at the direct expense of resilience. The late Bronze Age network had eliminated redundancy. It had become so good at moving resources from where they were to where they were needed that individual nodes stopped maintaining local reserves. Why store 3 years of grain when Egypt's surplus was always available? Why develop local bronze production when the Cypriot copper and Afghan tin arrived reliably every season? The answer, it turned out, was precisely for the moment when they didn't. Brandon Drake's isotope data, combined with dendrochronological records from Turkish junipers analyzed by Cornell's Sturt Manning, shows the drought was not a sudden shock. It was a slow degradation over several decades. The system had time to adapt. It didn't. The administrative records from Ugarit, Emar, and Alalak show palace economies continuing to allocate resources through centralized redistribution right up to the point of collapse. The same bureaucratic logic that had made them prosperous, now making them brittle. They optimized themselves into extinction. 5c. O momento de virada emocional. The last tablet from Ugarit is catalogued as RS 20.238. It is a letter from Eshuwara, the senior governor of Alashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit. It was written in response to an earlier message, now lost, in which the king of Ugarit had reported enemy ships offshore and requested military assistance. Eshuwara's reply is measured, diplomatic. He acknowledges the threat. He explains that his own forces are deployed elsewhere. He cannot send ships. He advises the king of Ugarit to be strong. The letter was found in the ruins of Ugarit. It never arrived. The king of Ugarit sent a message into the network that had sustained his civilization for 300 years. The network sent a reply. And somewhere in the distance between the writing and the reading, in the space where the old world used to be, both messages simply stopped. The scribes who baked these tablets into permanence so they would survive the journey did their jobs perfectly. The journey no longer existed. This isn't history. It's a warning. The Bronze Age network took roughly 300 years to build. It took 50 to destroy. And what replaced it, what archaeologists call the early Iron Age, was not a new civilization rising from the ashes of the old one. It was a simpler world, a smaller world, a world that had forgotten things. In Greece, the linear B writing system, the administrative script of the Mycenaean palace economy, disappeared completely. For roughly 400 years, the Greek world was effectively illiterate. Not because the knowledge was suppressed, because the institutions that transmitted it no longer existed. The scribes had nowhere to work. The palaces that employed them were gone. Writing had to be reinvented, from scratch, centuries later. Think about what that means. Not the loss of a dynasty or a city, the loss of the cognitive infrastructure, the accumulated, institutionalized knowledge that a civilization needs to reproduce itself across generations. The Bronze Age collapse didn't just kill people. It killed the systems through which people passed information forward in time. In 2008, economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff published This Time is Different, a study of 8 centuries of financial crises. Their central finding: every major systemic collapse in history has been preceded by the same pattern. Complexity increases. Interdependence deepens. Redundancy is eliminated in the name of efficiency. And then a multivariate shock, not one cause but several, arriving simultaneously, overwhelms a system that has optimized itself past the point of self-repair. They were writing about sovereign debt crises. They could have been writing about Ugarit. The supply chain disruptions of 2020 and 2021 exposed something that economists have been documenting for decades. The global economy had, in the name of just-in-time efficiency, eliminated almost all its buffers. Semiconductor shortages cascaded into automotive production halts, which cascaded into consumer goods delays, which cascaded into inflation in markets that had nothing to do with semiconductors. The system was so interconnected that a stress in one node propagated everywhere, not because anyone had designed it to fail, but because everyone had designed it to be maximally efficient. This is not a coincidence of structure. It is the same structure. The Late Bronze Age did not fall because it was primitive. It fell because it was advanced. Advanced enough to build interdependence at a scale that outran its capacity to absorb disruption. The civilizations of 1200 BCE were, in the ways that mattered most, doing exactly what we are doing now. Optimizing for throughput, eliminating friction, connecting everything to everything else, and calling it progress. The scribes of Ugarit weren't behind us. In some ways, they were ahead. Someone decided the Sea People's story was simpler, cleaner. An external enemy is always a more comfortable explanation than a structural failure you built yourself. The question is whether that decision, to reach for the invasion narrative rather than the systems analysis, was made once, in the 20th century, by historians looking for a clean answer, or whether it's a decision we keep making. The next time you hear the official version of a story, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? There is a word that appears in almost every account of the Bronze Age collapse: mysterious. The Sea Peoples were mysterious. The causes were mysterious. The speed of the collapse was mysterious. Historians have been calling it mysterious for 100 years, as if the absence of a single clean answer were itself the story, rather than a failure of the question. The collapse is not mysterious. It is legible. The tablets are there. The tree rings are there. The sediment cores are there. The destruction layers, the unfinished weapons, the unsent letters, all of it is there, in the ground, waiting to be read. What the evidence describes is not a mystery. It is a case study in what happens when a system mistakes efficiency for strength. The Bronze Age ended because the people living in it had built something genuinely extraordinary, and then forgot to ask what would happen if it broke. That is not a mystery. That is a pattern. Every generation inherits a version of the world and mistakes it for the natural order. The palace economies of Mycenae and Ugarit had existed for long enough that the scribes administering them had no lived memory of a world before them. The network was not a human construction to them. It was simply how things were. The grain came from Egypt. The copper came from Cyprus. The tin came from the east. It had always been this way. Until the day it hadn't. What collapsed in 1200 BCE was not just bronze and grain and writing. What collapsed was a civilization's model of its own permanence. The assumption, unspoken, structural, baked into every administrative tablet and diplomatic letter, that the system would continue because it always had. The scribes kept filing their documents. The ships kept sailing until they didn't. The letters kept being sent into a network that was already gone. There is something in that image that refuses to stay in the past. We build systems and we trust them. We optimize them and we depend on them. And we stop asking. Because the question is uncomfortable and the system is working and there are letters to send. We stop asking what happens when the reply doesn't come. The Bronze Age lasted roughly 2,000 years. It ended in 50. No one saw it coming. Not because the signs weren't there. Because the people reading the signs were the same people whose entire world depended on the signs being wrong. If a civilization this sophisticated could vanish so completely that it forgot how to write, what are the systems we depend on today that we have stopped questioning? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the island where 7 men secretly rewrote the rules of money, and how that meeting has never officially happened. The scribes of Ugarit sent their last letters into silence. We are still waiting to find out if ours get through. History isn't what happened, it's what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget.